History remembers the winter of 1812 with a single, brutal image, a line of frozen ghosts staggering out of Russia. This was the ghost of an army, the Grande Armée. Napoleon Bonaparte's invincible force, shattered not just by cannonballs, but by something far older, far more relentless. Snow, ice, and a terrible, gnawing hunger. Napoleon, the master of Europe, had made his single greatest mistake. He had marched 600,000 men into the heart of Russia and led fewer than 100,000 out. The story is one of hubris, of fire, and of a cold so profound it could freeze the soul. But this is not just a story about the fall of an emperor. It's a story about what we find in ourselves when everything else is lost. Buried beneath the ice of that legendary retreat lies another story, one that was nearly forgotten. It's the story of a forgotten act of heroism, a quiet battle waged not with a sword, but with a scalpel. This is the story of the one man Napoleon himself called the most virtuous man I have ever known. A doctor who, in the middle of hell, chose to save everyone. His name was Dominique Jean Larrey, and his fight was for the soul of medicine itself. Our story begins not in the snow, but under the summer sun of June 1812. The largest European army ever assembled is crossing the Niemen River into Russia, a tidal wave of humanity. Over 500,000 men. They are confident, almost arrogant. Their leader, Napoleon, is at the height of his power. What could possibly stop them? Among the endless columns of infantry and cavalry is a man who thinks differently. Baron Dominique Jean Larrey is the surgeon-in-chief of the Grande Armée. At 46, he is a veteran of Napoleon's campaigns from Egypt to Austria. He has seen more suffering than any general, and he has dedicated his life to lessening it. Larrey wasn't just a doctor, he was a revolutionary. In an age where the wounded were left on the battlefield for days, Larrey had invented something radical, the ambulance volantes, or flying ambulances. These were lightweight, horse-drawn wagons designed to rush onto the battlefield during the fighting, retrieve the wounded, and bring them back for immediate care. It was a system built on a simple, shocking principle: speed. He understood the concept of the golden hour 2 centuries before it was named. To the rigid military minds of the time, it was chaos. To Larrey, it was humanity. And his ambulances would soon be tested in a crucible of unimaginable scale. The French advanced, but the Russian army refused to give them the decisive battle Napoleon craved. They just retreated, deeper and deeper into the vastness of Russia, burning the crops and poisoning the wells as they went. The Grande Armée wasn't being defeated, it was being swallowed. Disease and desertion began to do what no enemy army could. Then came Borodino, September 7th, 1812, one of the bloodiest single days of conflict in human history until the First World War. Over 70,000 casualties in a single day. It was the battle Napoleon wanted, a brutal, head-on collision. For Larrey, it was a 24-hour nightmare. He and his teams worked with furious purpose. Amidst the thunder of 1,200 cannons, they drove their flying ambulances into the heart of the action. Larrey himself performed over 200 amputations in the first 24 hours, a staggering number. His coat soaked in blood, he worked without rest, his hands moving with a surgeon's precision while the world tore itself apart around him. He established a triage system that was unheard of. Who was treated first? Not the generals, not the high-ranking officers. The most grievously wounded were treated first, regardless of rank or even nationality. A wounded Russian soldier received the same care as one of Napoleon's imperial guard. This was his code. In the chaos of war, Larrey's operating theater was an island of radical equality. The French won the battle, technically. The road to Moscow was open. A week later, Napoleon entered the ancient capital, expecting a delegation of nobles to offer him the keys to the city. Instead, he found a ghost town, eerily silent. And then, the fires began. The Russians had set their own holy city ablaze. For 4 days, Moscow burned. Napoleon had his prize, but it was an empire of ash. The victory was hollow. There was no surrender, no treaty, just the coming wind, which was growing colder. On October 19th, after 5 weeks of fatal hesitation, the order was given. The Grande Armée was to turn back. The retreat had begun. The man who marches into Russia in the summer is not the same man who stumbles out in the winter. The retreat was a different kind of war. The enemy was no longer just the Russian army, but the cold, the snow, the starvation. The temperature plummeted to depths the French had never known. -20. -30. Discipline dissolved. Regiments melted away into mobs of desperate, shivering men. Their only thought was survival. They burned priceless furniture from Russian palaces just for a few moments of warmth. They killed their own horses for food. Comradeship died, replaced by a brutal, individual struggle for life. But through this frozen hell, Dominique Larrey's mission did not change. While others abandoned their cannons and their loot, Larrey fought to save his medical wagons. He protected his surgical tools, his bandages, and his precious supply of wine and broth for the wounded. Starving soldiers, their eyes hollow with desperation, would try to raid his convoys. Larrey, the quiet doctor, would stand them down. He argued, he pleaded, he commanded. He reminded them of their duty, of their humanity. He insisted that the supplies were for them, for the moment they fell, wounded or sick. He was protecting their own salvation. There are accounts of him walking the entire distance, giving his own horse to a wounded soldier. He would search the snow for men who had collapsed, bringing them to his own campfire, sharing his meager rations. He gathered the wounded into small, protected squares at night to shield them from the cold. He was no longer just a surgeon. He was a shepherd for a dying flock. While generals were abandoning their men, Larrey was risking his life for them. He saw no uniform, only a patient. He treated French, Polish, Italian, and just as often, the wounded Russian soldiers left to die by their own retreating army. To Larrey, a man in need of help was a man in need of help. Period. His morality was absolute, even when the world around him had descended into absolute savagery. And then came the river, the Berezina. The name itself is a scar on the French soul. It was late November. The remnants of the Grande Armée reached the river, only to find the bridge destroyed and the Russian army closing in on 3 sides. It was a trap. French combat engineers, standing chest-deep in lethally cold water, worked frantically to build 2 makeshift pontoon bridges. The temperature was -22 Fahrenheit. Many of the engineers would freeze to death where they stood. Their sacrifice bought the army its only chance. What followed was one of the most horrific scenes of the Napoleonic Wars. A frantic, desperate crush of men, horses, and wagons trying to cross the 2 narrow, rickety bridges while Russian artillery rained down upon them. Panic erupted. The bridges became a vortex of death. Men were trampled, pushed into the icy water, crushed by wagon wheels. It was the ultimate test of survival. And in the very heart of this chaos was Dominique Larrey. He set up his operating station on the western bank, in the open, under direct cannon fire. As the wounded were carried across, he and his surgeons went to work. They performed amputations and treated wounds with shells exploding around them. When his colleagues urged him to cross and save himself, he refused. Not until every wounded man who could be moved was across. He personally directed the traffic of his medical wagons, forcing a path through the panicked mob. At one point, a surge of desperate men pushed one of his wagons carrying surgical equipment toward the river. Larrey, seeing it, ran and physically placed his body in front of the wheels, screaming at the soldiers until they relented. He saved the tools that would, in turn, save them. Larrey was one of the last to cross the Berezina. He had made it, but thousands hadn't. The army that emerged on the other side was a shadow. Of the 600,000 who entered Russia, only a few tens of thousands stumbled back across the Niemen River in December. The Grande Armée was dead. Napoleon rushed ahead to Paris to save his throne. The generals who survived would be remembered for their failures or their resilience. But the legacy of Dominique Jean Larrey was different. It wasn't written in battle maps or treaties, but in the lives of the men he saved. Years later, in exile on the island of St. Helena, a defeated Napoleon wrote his last will and testament. He left bequests to the people who had meant the most to him. And on that list, he wrote, "I bequeath to the Surgeon-in-Chief, Larrey, 100,000 francs. He is the most virtuous man I have ever known." Empires fall. Armies turn to dust. The great strategies of emperors become footnotes in history books. But the legacy of a man like Larrey endures. He wasn't a conqueror. He built no monuments of stone. His life's work was to repair what the conquerors had broken. In the darkest chapter of the Napoleonic saga, amidst the failure, the horror, and the soul-crushing cold, this quiet doctor held a lamp of humanity. He proved that true honor isn't found in victory, but in compassion. And that even when an army of 500,000 men is lost, the effort to save just one life is never, ever forgotten.